What's up, guys? It's Branden Flash. Today we're at NEVI Go Station, but this is just one of the sites we're visiting. And today we're going to be talking about DC fast charger current ratings and also cable ratings as a bottleneck. And we're going to be starting with this 50 kilowatt unit right here. And before we dive in on what my cable current rating recommendations are for different power levels, I think it's important to touch on some of the basics here. And if you're watching this, hopefully you already know this, but if you don't, please watch. I think it'll be pretty helpful. When it comes to power, there are essentially two different things that are factoring in, and it's part of Ohm's law, which is actually my license plate. You have voltage and you have current. So voltage is set in EV charging by the vehicle's battery. As the state of charge goes down, the voltage goes down. And as the state of charge goes up, the voltage goes up. That's kind of essentially determined by the vehicle's battery architecture. You have essentially two classes of battery architecture voltages. You have the 400 volt vehicles, which are most vehicles on the road, including Teslas, including my Rivian as well. And that encompasses vehicles that operate in the typically 300-ish to nearly 500-ish voltage, or 500 volt range. And then you have what are essentially considered the 800 volt vehicles, and those operate in the 550 volt to 920 volt range, roughly. And in order to determine power, or watts or kilowatts, you actually have to multiply the voltage by the current, which is in amps. That is how it works for DC power as well as for single phase AC power. Three phase AC power gets a little bit more complicated. You actually have to multiply then by 1.73, or the square root of 3, to determine power with three phases, but we're not going to be touching on that today. Today we're talking about DC fast charging and how current ratings of the cables actually can impact your charging experience, and why it's so important for charge point operators when they're selecting hardware, or even site hosts when they're talking to different charge point operators, for if they're considering being a site host, to be aware of these things and how they can really impact the charging experience of the EV drivers. So right now we're at a 50 kilowatt station, but I think the primary focus of this video is going to be on 100 plus kilowatt charging, specifically 150 kilowatt plus charging, because 150 kilowatt is the minimum requirement for the Inflation Reduction Act NEVI FHWA recommendation. That's a mouthful, but it's basically 150 kilowatt is the minimum for the federal funding program for EV charging. That's kind of rolling out right now and starting to become a pretty large consideration for charge point operators, which is why I think it's so important to talk about this. Behind me, we have a 50 kilowatt EV Go station. This unit is actually from 2015, according to the date code on the side of it. And even though it's 50 kilowatt, it can only output up to 100 amps. And what does that mean for EV drivers? Well, if you have a vehicle that the battery voltage is at 330 volts, for example, which is a very reasonable thing that could happen on, say, a Mustang Mach-E, a smaller battery Tesla, or many other vehicles, you would only get 33 kilowatts. Whereas if you had a Rivian, for example, with up to 450 volt pack, and you're at about 50% state of charge, you would get about 42 kilowatts. So while I think 100 amps is a bit low, it's acceptable given the age of the unit. And my recommendation for a 50 kilowatt station, as far as the station output rating, as well as the cable minimum output rating, would be 125 amps, or more ideally 150 amps, but I think 125 amps will give a good experience to most drivers. And I also want to mention that today we're going to be talking about what will deliver a good experience for most drivers, but may not necessarily deliver nameplate power to every vehicle. Because if you're going for delivering full power to every single vehicle, you're likely going to have too high of a rating that's a bit unnecessary. And I think it's important to kind of serve the majority rather than the small outliers here and there. So 50 kilowatt, I recommend 125 amp minimum, 150 amp ideally. And we've now made it to an EV Go station at a shopping complex called Carmel Commons. Behind me we have a 350 kilowatt liquid cooled dispenser with dual output. And over here we have two 100 kilowatt units that can both simultaneously charge actually. And let's start with the 350 kilowatt unit and talk about how it does some power sharing and the current ratings of the cables as well as the dispenser. So unfortunately this unit is out of service. It's been out of service for 2+ weeks now, so I can't demonstrate for you, but we can at least talk about this in theory because I've used this unit a fair bit. So we'll look at the data label here. So here we have DC input. So it'll do 500 amps plus 200 amps. And then the output is 500 amps plus 200 amps. So if you're not familiar, this box right here is only a dispenser. Over there, you can see the white box above the Nero there, and that's actually the power conversion cabinet. So that's what's taking the AC power and converting it to DC power. And if you haven't already, definitely recommend you watching my site architecture overview video comparing all the different sites and some different hardware. Very valuable, and I think that's a good precursor to this video. But here we have liquid cooled cables. So these are made by a company called Huber & Sooner, as you can see here. And these are actually the same cable, not 100% sure if they're the same variant that Electrify America uses. And you can see underneath here that it has an output rating of 500 amps. And that's because it's liquid cooled. And unfortunately, these cables are actually a very failure prone component, unfortunately, in my experience. I've heard that the new versions are better, but on Electrify America at least, they fail very commonly. And as many of you may have experienced, when they fail, they have a couple different failure modes. The most common that you'll likely experience is that the thermistors, or thermal resistors essentially, inside the cable that are communicating to the dispenser what the temperature of the cable is to help regulate the thermal management system, they'll actually drop out of communication and the cable will go to a fail-safe mode of sorts. You'll get somewhere between roughly 32 and 42 kilowatts, typically about 36, 37 kilowatts. And you're gonna have a severely degraded charging experience. So that's by far the most common failure there. You can also have the actual cooling unit inside the dispenser fail. And these cables just are generally pretty poor ergonomics in my experience, given that it's kind of hard to wield, and if you need to twist it, they're kind of slippery. They're just not great. I don't love these cables, but they do deliver the power when they're working. And on this particular unit, this will actually deliver up to 540 amps despite what the label says. What I would like to see is that if you're doing dual output here, rather than having 500 plus 200 amps, I would rather see that they have just 700 amps going to the unit and then using a buck converter, or even having it come to the dispenser at a higher voltage. So you need less current and you need smaller conductors from the dispenser to the cabinet, and then using a buck converter to actually adjust the voltage and vary the voltage for the two outputs and be able to balance the power more effectively to actually give at least pretty close to 175 kilowatts per handle. When it's in power sharing, I don't necessarily expect full current because that's just not that reasonable. But I think it would be a reasonable expectation to think that each channel could output, say, 300 amps or 350 amps, and that would deliver a good experience to most drivers. Let's move over to the 100 kilowatt units and talk about those. So as I mentioned, these are 100 kilowatt all-in-one DC fast chargers. You can see the Nero that just left there. And these will actually output up to 100 kilowatts or 200 amps. You can see that right there. So output is 200 amps, and these are actually an all-in-one unit because you can see the input is 3-phase 480 volt AC power rather than DC power. So this is actually taking the grid connection and pulling it into the unit here, and then taking that grid connection and outputting into DC. And because this is a 200 amp output unit, we have a 200 amp output cable. So this is not the bottleneck for the station. And I believe that a 200 amp cable is pretty reasonable for a 100 kilowatt unit. And while it would be better to have it be a 250 or a 300 amp cable, There are some practical aspects here, such as cable cost, cable availability, and just the different ratings of cables that are on the market. So I think a 250 amp cable would probably be a little bit more appropriate, but those are less common than 200 amp cables. And in a supply constrained world, that does have to be a consideration. And realistically, a 200 amp cable will deliver good power to most vehicles. So for example, with my Rivian R1T, I would get up to max of about 90 kilowatts, which is very close to the nameplate rating, and I would view that as acceptable. If you have a Mach-E, for example, you might only get 60, 70 kilowatts, which is not great. However, these are typically only installed alongside the higher power unit that we just talked about. So generally these should be used by the Bolts, the Neros, the Konas, just generally slower charging vehicles to reserve the higher power for the vehicles that can actually take it. And now that EVgo is starting to transition to kilowatt hour pricing in more states, they actually just implemented that here in North Carolina. It is actually fair-ish to be using the slower charger because you're paying the same on the slower charger or on the faster charger for the energy that you receive. Whereas previously, it was actually the same per minute cost, whether you were using the slower charger or the faster charger, which for someone like me with a fast charging vehicle, if I'm stuck using a slower charger, I'm paying significantly more per kilowatt hour than I would be on the faster charger. But that's a bit of a topic for a different video here. But overall, 200 amp is acceptable on a 100 kilowatt unit. However, ideally, it would be 250 or 300 amps. And now let's go to Circle K and talk about 120 kilowatt and 180 kilowatt charging stations, as well as boost or overboost functions on cables and thermal derates. And we've made it to Circle K in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Here we have 180 kilowatt right there and 120 kilowatt right there. And we're going to be using the 180 kilowatt essentially interchangeably with the 150 kilowatt, with a little bit of a caveat to talk about power ratings. So this particular unit is an ABB Terra 184, and it's actually the HC or high current variant, which is not typical. So if you watched Kyle's video on out of spec reviews talking about an Excel Energy site that had the same hardware, that actually was the non-high current variant, so that was limited to 200 amps due to the cable. However, this cable here, it's a REMA 300 amp cable, but the cool thing is it can actually do 400 amps output because it uses what's called a boost function, kind of marketing term more than anything else. But essentially it can run above its nominal rating of 300 amps for a set period of time or based on thermal derate. So basically you can run it at 400 amps, and then as it gets warm, it will reduce down to the 300 amp nominal or actual rating of the cable itself. Over here we have a Power Electronics NB120. It's a 120 kilowatt unit, and it has 200 amp rated cables. However, it can actually output 300 amps on those cables, again with a boost function that allows it to run over its nominal rating until it derates. And I've actually personally tested this unit to output 300 amps plus or minus for about 40 minutes or so with my Rivian. So I've really stress tested this unit, and it delivers the power that you'd expect. So unlike ChargePoint CP250s, so they're lower power units in their paired configuration that can do 125 kilowatt, or at least labeled as such, those are actually limited to 200 amps, meaning that even though they're 125 kilowatt power conversion capability in that paired configuration when only one vehicle is plugged in, most vehicles, so Rivians, Lightnings, Mach-E's, Teslas, any 400 volt class vehicle, they'll actually only get about 60 to maybe 90 kilowatts. And you'd actually need an 800 volt class vehicle to get that full 125 kilowatt plus or minus, or at least a vehicle over 675 volts. Or sorry, 625 volts. But that doesn't leave a whole lot of vehicles that will actually get the full power. So that power conversion capability and even that grid connection are kind of wasted to an extent, which is really unfortunate. Luckily, in a lot of cases, that's kind of just a bonus functionality. They're generally intended to be 2 times 62.5 kilowatts. But if you're trying to advertise it as 125 kilowatt, it should be able to deliver it to a 400 volt class vehicle. So let's talk about the 120 kilowatt. So I think this is pretty much ideal. You have a 200 amp nominal cable or even a 300 amp nominal cable. But I think 300 amps is kind of the sweet spot for 120 kilowatt. So basically anywhere from 110 to like 130 kilowatt, roughly, that kind of class of charger. 120 kilowatt is going to be the most common because typically charger power modules, at least right now, are 30 kilowatt. So 120 makes sense. But let me just show you that we're actually getting 120 kilowatt on my Rivian right now. So there we have it, 118.7 kilowatt, which I would call 120 kilowatt, close enough. See what the truck is showing. So the truck's actually showing 120 kilowatt. I don't know which one you want to believe, but it's close enough that I would call that essentially 120 kilowatt, which is delivering what the unit is labeled as and what a EV driver would expect pulling up to this, plugging in and seeing the labeling. And then here we have that ABB Terra 184, so 180 kilowatt unit. And these cables, these are 300 amp rated. You can see right there. So 300 amps. However, if you look at the unit data label, so right over here. So output CCS 1, and then you have a nominal and a max rating. So as I was mentioning, nominal output 300 amps, maximum output 400 amps. This second one is CHAdeMO. We're not going to talk about that today. We're talking about CCS. And what's cool is that if this was a dual CCS variant, this can actually support simultaneous charging. It will just do a fixed split of 90 kilowatt, 90 kilowatt if it's being in use by one vehicle, or 180 kilowatt if it's in use by one vehicle. But rather than only be able to do 200 amps per channel to get 90 kilowatt, this unit can actually deliver 600 amps of power conversion capability. So each channel or each output actually can get 300 amps, which is a much improved customer experience. And most vehicles, there's a guy here doing a burnout. I don't understand. He was literally spinning his tires. And with 300 amps per channel, most vehicles will actually be able to get that full 90 kilowatts, which I think is really important if you're actually reducing the power for someone by sharing it, to actually be able to give them the full power capability possible. As this relates to NEVI or the federal funding, the Federal Highway Administration has mandated 150 kilowatts dedicated per post is the minimum power output requirement. However, we're already starting to see some products that are claiming to be NEVI compliant with 200 amp cables. And if you've watched this far, you already understand what the problem here is. Most vehicles will not be able to get 150 kilowatts with a 200 amp cable. They'll only be able to get somewhere in the 60 to 90 kilowatt range. And that's not 150 kilowatt, and that's definitely not within the spirit of the 150 kilowatt requirement. So my recommendation for any federal policymakers, state NEVI policy people, whatever, anyone that has anything to do with NEVI or just wants to deliver a good customer experience with a unit labeled as 150 kilowatt, I think it's really important that we set a minimum of 350 amps for that 150 kilowatt power level. Ideally, we'd be seeing 400 amps or even higher, but I think 350 amps is a very good middle ground and also allows the use of air-cooled cables. So both of the cables that I just showed you here are air-cooled. So that means they don't have a liquid cooling system that's yet another component to fail. And actually, the only cable that we've shown today so far was a Huber & Suner 500 amp cable on the Delta EVgo unit that was liquid cooled. Every other cable we've looked at today has been air cooled. Personally, I think that air cooled cables are the way to go for right now, at least for public charging installations. There are cases that liquid cooling makes sense. So it could be a fleet application or a heavy duty application that has a need for very high current for extended periods due to very large batteries. However, for public charging, most of the time you're going to be having those 25 to 30 minute sessions roughly, and most of those vehicles are fairly small batteries, and that's well within the realm of that boost function on these newer cables like what's installed here. So going back to 180 kilowatt, my recommendation at that power level, probably 400 amps for 180 kilowatt. And I think it's also important to mention that, at least as of today, CCS has a current limitation of 500 amps, which means that most vehicles that are charging really quickly, so the Porsche Taycan, the Lucid Air, the Kia EV6, Hyundai Ioniq 5, basically any of the 800 volt class vehicles, or basically any vehicle that goes over 200 kilowatt charging capability, they're actually higher voltage vehicles. And as I touched on in the beginning of the beginning of this video, if you raise the voltage, you can lower the current. So as those vehicles are charging really quickly, they actually have a lower current request than these slower charging vehicles because of the higher voltage. So I think for practical purposes, most public charging installations can get away with air-cooled cables, especially as we start to see 500 amp boost rating air-cooled cables, which are already being deployed in Europe, but haven't quite come to the US and Canada with CCS 1. So hopefully that sheds some light on the varying requirements of public charging installations and how to properly size the cable ratings and specify your requirements for an installation, whether you're a site host, a charge point operator, a hardware manufacturer, whatever the case may be. At all points throughout this, it's important to select the right cable and the right current capability for the charging installation, or you're going to be delivering an experience to the EV driver, whether that's your customer per se or not. So if you're a hardware manufacturer, you're not actually selling to EV drivers. Well, hopefully the CPO has EV drivers on their team. But the hardware manufacturer is not selling to that end user, the EV drivers. So they don't necessarily care. They just want to sell the hardware. But the charge point operator that's purchasing the hardware needs to be aware of the experience that they're delivering to their customers, as do the site hosts, in my opinion, because if you have a poor experience, whether you're technically the owner operator of that equipment or not, it's still the experience that someone is having on your property. So that's something that you should be aware of and specifying the right requirements for. If you haven't already, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Would love to hear some comments down below on your thoughts on this topic. I know a lot of people in the industry watch my videos, so hopefully this is helpful. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.